very close to my heart, especially being both a gerontologist and as a geriatrician. What I have found is that we have a problem in dealing with death. We have a problem of talking about death with our patients and with the family. I want to bring you a few quotes from various people from around the world, or as we know them. Isaac Asimov once said that life is pleasant, death is peaceful, but it's the transition stage that is troublesome. And that's what we have to deal with. The problem of between, I don't think we have to deal with death as such as death. We have to deal with the suffering and the process of dying. This anxiety, which we call death anxiety, is called Thanatophobia in a more fancy type of medical terminology. And what it comes from the Greek god Xanthos, who was the Greek god of death. There's a statue of him in Artemis, which is in Turkey, and it's from the area of 325 BCE. So, what do we mean by death anxiety? It's an anxious feeling of dread or apprehension when one thinks of the process of dying or the inevitability of death. So this is what we're feeling. We get worried. What does it mean? We're going to die. So do we get anxious? And the question is, death is defined as a termination of biological life. Okay, we can accept death. We know what death is. We know what life is. What is going to happen in between? Often I would say to my students, I know that you will be born and I know that you will die. What is going to happen in between, I have absolutely no idea. And that's what brings us into this anxiety, because we worry. So, man is the only animal that knows he will die someday. We all know, we're all aware of it, that we will die. We can't tell exactly when. Hopefully we can't tell. But we know that there is an end to our life. We cannot live until the end of our days. And so fear of death is uniquely human. It doesn't mean that when an animal is being chased by a lion, a zebra is being chased by a lion, he doesn't know that death is in front of him. But it's not that he thinks of it ahead of time. He'll be eating quite happily until the lion chases him. It's only humans who think what will happen in another day, month, year, or whatever. And in the 21st century, what have we done? What have we taken 21st century? We've taken death out of a natural occurrence and made it an experience which occurs inside hospitals. That's where people die. People don't die at home usually. It's not true often in areas, in rural areas. It's not really true in developing countries, less developed countries, but definitely in the more developed countries, or what we would call Eastern Europe, in Europe, America, South and North America, and a lot of Asia as well. So they're dying at hospitals. And we are surrounded by medical technology. They are connected to IV drips. They have an ECG. They'll have a monitor. They'll have their blood pressure taken. They'll have be given oxygen. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of action. And this is not how we would like to think, as how we would like to end our life. But it's a taboo subject. We don't talk about it. We use euphemisms. We're ending at the end of your period of living in this country, or living in this world. We don't have anything to really help. We don't talk about, your death is in front of you. Confucius said some very, obviously we know that Confucius has some very amazing statements. One of these statements is, how can we know death if we don't know how to live? So we've got to know how to live in order to know what death is. On the other hand, how can we know how to live if we don't understand death? So we've got to learn and understand the process and what is death for us. Freud said the aim of life is death. We live to die. And Jung said, life is like a parable, starts at birth and ends at death. In other words, death is a part of the life cycle. It's not that death is not part of life. Yes, it is part of life. And Klein said death anxiety is one of the basic feelings of humanity, and there's a root to all anxiety. This is what puts us into a lot of tension and problems. Kubler-Ross, which we all know her 5 stages of dying, which is, we know it's, of course, the stage of denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and then acceptance. We don't usually go through all of them. We may jump from one stage to the other at any time of the process. And she says the problem of death anxiety is more a fear of death and psychological adjustment with the dying process. That's a very important thing, the dying process, because death anxiety consists of 2 independent but connected constructs: death itself and psychological adjustment with the dying process. Kamel and Dapola said, until this day, the argument remains, is one conceptually talking, when we're talking about death anxiety, about fear of death, or are we talking about the fear of the dying process? It's not the same. And this is what we're going to understand, particularly when we're dealing with the elderly. So I was dealt with this problem as I was working through my career in geriatrics and gerontology. And I kept asking myself, are our patients really worried about death? Or what are they worried about? So what causes anxiety about death? Well, what lies beyond? We all talk about the fact of life after death. Does it exist? We all talk about the fact that we're going to be judged when we get to the gates of heaven. And so what lies beyond death? Are we going to be going to heaven? Are we going to the so-called concept of hell? We know that science has failed to stop death. That causes anxiety. People say, even on not only on death anxiety, people are anxious because we can't stop Alzheimer's disease. And people are all anxious about it. What science hasn't got the cause, science hasn't stopped this. And the same thing, people would like to live to whatever age is given to them. And whatever the age is, if it's 100, if they're going to live to 96, they would like to live to 95 years, 364 days, and the 95th year, they die the next day. That's how they would like, but it doesn't occur that way. When we fail to understand a phenomenon, we construct our own image of it, which tends to be negative or destructive, such as we see in this picture. We think that death is something really going to cause us a lot of problems. We're going to die. What is going to happen? And threatening to take away everything we care about. We care about our family, we care about our children. And when you speak to the elderly, and this is an important thing, when we speak to the elderly, they say, what's going to happen to my husband? What's going to happen to my children? What's going to happen to my grandchildren? How can I leave them? What can I do? And we know that couples, old couples, tend to keep themselves alive, each other keeping themselves alive for the spouse. If the husband was to die, the wife often dies soon after, within the year after his death. In my particular case, with my parents, they died within 2 weeks of each other at the age of 90. And you loss of control. You're losing, what can I do? I can't control, I can't stop this. What's going to happen? I'm going to die. And this is what happens. So we have characteristics of death anxiety. What are they? It's a fear of physical suffering. That's the first thing which elderly will tell you. I don't want to suffer. A fear of isolation and loneliness. It's not the process that I want to be left alone, a fear of cowardice and humiliation, a fear of failing to achieve important goals. I still haven't got the bargaining power. I still haven't got to see my granddaughter finish university. I still haven't seen my first great-grandchild. These are the goals they're setting for themselves and they haven't achieved. What's going to happen to the survivors? The fear of impact on survivors. The fear of punishment or of the unknown, as we mentioned. Fear of death of others. What's going to happen? We're looking at others and the fear of non-being, not being around. I'm no longer in existence. And just as it says, the elephant is in the room and says, I'm right there in the room and no one even acknowledges me. It's like you're an elephant. You're there in the room and nobody says anything about it. And this is what causes them to be a lot of tension and anxiety. So what can be the attitude to death? Death is an integral part of life, I mentioned. Consequently, a subject of concern at some stages of our lives. What stages do we tend to have more anxiety and less anxiety? Well, think about that and we will talk about it a bit later. And it varies between each individual. I cannot say that it's easier for a person who comes from Buddhist religion or from a Muslim religion or a Jewish religion or agnostic. It's and even within those religions, each one has a different attitude towards the process of dying. And it's also a collective view based on a variety of world events. Well, we are now going through so many upheavals throughout the world, not only in terms of war, which is happening between Ukraine and Russia, and that's causing a lot of concern for most of Europe now, because they're worried that it might spread, but also the climate changes. What's going to happen? Are we going to have to move from where we're living? How is it going to affect us? So there are very variables which exist. What could they be? Well, the first one is age. What happens? When you think about it, the greatest, it's like a person goes up, it goes up in a curve and then comes down. What does it mean? In the beginning, people are less worried about death. We know it. The youngsters who do the crazy things like jumping on bungee, jumping off bridges, who does skydiving, who rides these mountain bikes down alpine mountains. It's the youngsters, so-called youngsters, the age 20, 30. And who is, they don't worry about death. When do they start? When they have children, when they have getting to the age of 30, 40, 50, 60. That's when they're very anxious about death because they've still got things to do. They've still got to bring up their children. They've still got to get them to university and look after them. And when they get to the old age, it seems to drop. So age and anxiety changes. If we are more religious, are we more anxious or less anxious? It's both ways. If you're very worried that maybe when you come after death in front of the judgment and you feel that you haven't done what you should have done during your lifetime, then you may be very anxious about death. On the other hand, it may be a relief that you have life after death. You're going to live in the heavens and have a good life. So it changes in religiosity. Gender, is it more with females, more with males? And the last thing is the psychological state. If we suffer from depression, if we suffer from anxiety, is it going to be worse or better, or what happens? So, age, it decreases from the age of 60. Anxiety about death decreases from the age of 60. They are less worried about death. Religion, amati, it can be different. Sometimes it decreases the death anxiety, sometimes it increases. Gender, some have found it greater in males, and some have found it greater in females. So we don't really know. And a strong connection with the presence of generalized anxiety. and culture. It's also a culture state as well. Culture had a major effect on how nurses adapt to death. This was a study done in Egypt. And so it can be culturally related. Some people might accept it more, some people might accept it less, and so on. So I set out and did a study. It wasn't a large study, but it was an important study in my eyes. I went along and I said, okay, we're going to ask, and we're going to test this concept of death anxiety amongst elderly and amongst their children. Let's see what happens. Well, the mean age of the parent cohort, which was 44 subjects, was 82 years old. They were equally divided between males and females. Most of them were from Eastern Europe, and so had been, a lot of them, Holocaust survivors. So about 50% of the elderly were married. The mean educational level was 9 years, which is quite high. And they did have cardiac health problems, 61% of them. Were they religious? They were taking a fair number of drugs, not many, drug groups. And were they religious? Well, they do believe in a superior being, but they do go to synagogue, but they were not that religious. The elderly were, but the youngsters were not. They were younger. Obviously, the children are about the generation below. They were 30 years younger, 52. They had a high level of education, and they were not so religious anymore. The main caregiver tended to be either the son or daughter, or both, so that it wasn't just one area I was examining. They tend to live close by their parents, tend to visit their parents at least once, phone them once a week. And then I asked them, how much were you, the children, how much were you involved in your parents' health problems? 84%. Emotional support, yes, but not in financial. And the parents did not want them to be involved in the financial aspects, which was interesting. I used the Templar's Death Anxiety Scale. It's a simple questionnaire. It's a yes/no, which sometimes I don't like, but this one I thought would be all right. It's 15 questions, and I asked, it asks things like, I'm very much afraid to die, or no thought of death seldom enters my mind. So there are various areas of constructs within the death anxiety scale. There is the concept of death. I'm very much afraid to die. I'm not afraid to die at all, opposite, but the thought of death never bothers me. So here's death. What else? Disease. So they're worried about disease, maybe. I dread to think about having an operation. I'm not particularly afraid of getting cancer. I'm really scared of having a heart attack. So they're worried about disease. Time. I'm often distressed by the way time flies so rapidly. I often think about how short life really is, and I feel that the future holds nothing for me to fear. Okay, religion. The subject of life after death troubles me greatly. So this questionnaire has various areas which we could understand and discuss. So what could it? 15, you get 15 out of 15, you are severely anxious on death anxiety scale. So what I did is I gave this questionnaire to the parents and asked them to fill out what their answers were. So it's a subjective feeling of the person. I then gave it to the child, the main caregiver, it was either the daughter or the son, according to whoever was the main caregiver. And then I gave it again, and I said, okay, to the child, now that you've filled out this form, please think how your parents filled out this form. What do you think your parents said about the question? And that was what was the interesting part for me, because the parents scored 4 out of 15. They were not anxious about death. The child scored himself 7 out of 15. But notice what the child says about his parents. That my parents are highly anxious about death. They scored their parents 8 out of 15. And this already shows you this major difference between the two participant subjects, the parents and the children. So when you looked at the assessment and you went through the various questions, I'm not going to go through everything, but I'm just going to show you this. I fear dying a painful death. I'm worried about having the dying process. I'm worried about having death. This is what's going to bother me. How am I going to die? So when you ask the children, what are they worried about? They're more worried about, if you look at the difference between I'm not at all afraid to die. The children said, no, that's not true. I'm very afraid to die. The thought of death never bothers me. No, it bothers them. Quite opposite to what their parents are. And I'm very much afraid to die. Yes, they are. This is the concept when I told you that the high death anxiety is at the time of middle age. When the children are assessing their parents, look what happens. Again, the children say that their parents are worried about, afraid to die. They definitely are afraid to die. And the thought never bothers me. No, it bothers them all the time. But it's not. So what we have is, and what's interesting, dread to think about having an operation. They think that their parents are absolutely in high anxiety about having some sort of disease process, or the sight of a dead body is horrifying to me. I remember when I was working in the geriatric ward, and there were maybe two or three people in the same room, and one person would suddenly become very sick and would start dying, and we'd close off the curtains to give some sort of privacy. Next door, the older person would sit down and carry on eating. And you would say to us, no, this can't be. It can't be. How can this be? No, because they're not afraid of death. They're afraid of the dying process. Now, what did actually affect the level of death anxiety in the elderly was more the religiosity of the parents. That had some sort of effect on it. And also, well, the SAST is the anxiety instrument which I developed, which tests for the presence of anxiety in the elderly. And that was also, if you are highly anxious prior to this, then you're going to probably have a higher death anxiety score. Short Sung is a score for depression, and that didn't have an effect, no. But your actual presence of anxiety did. So, when we try to sort of break down a little bit this concept, this is the score on the death anxiety scale. We see that talking about disclosure and non-disclosure, one of the major problems which we have is when you go to a child, we used to be very paternalistic. It's changing now. But as medical doctors or physicians, we are very paternalistic. I know what is best for you. Listen to me because I'm a doctor. So they would, an elderly person would be admitted to the hospital. He would find out that the person has cancer. And then they would go and tell the children and not tell the elderly person, which is now by law forbidden in Israel. But it generally it's not a good thing. So there was a concept that the children of disclosure or non-disclosure. So what did we find? If there was a disclosure and the children accepted to tell their parents, then the score was lower. When they had non-disclosure, the score was much higher. And this was significant because they were saying, the people who do non-disclosure, you will not tell my parent, he will go into severe anxiety, he will go and kill himself, he'll jump off the building, whatever you want. We also looked at the gender of the child if this had an effect, whether it was a male or female. We found that the males, if they had disclosure, tended to give a much lower score of death anxiety to the parents, but the female gave a very high score. So there's a gender playing a part here. Non-disclosure, we found again that the males gave a high score but lower than the females. So now let's look at the gender of the parents in terms of disclosure from male and female. Well, what we found was that the males on non-disclosure, 83% did not want to tell their fathers. 17% did not want to tell their mothers. On the females, it was about half-half. Half were prepared to tell their fathers, and about half were not prepared to tell the parents, and about half not to tell their mother. So again, there's this interaction of the various genders also playing a part. So what was the conclusions we got? First of all, children are involved in parents' decision-making process all the time. They are there. They're there for health, they are there for support, not for financial, but for everything else, yes. However, the children are apt in assessing absence of death anxiety in their own parents and to favor non-disclosure of information. Now we know what are the parents actually worrying about. What the parents, when you go back and you think about it, are not worried about death. You can talk about death with your elderly patient. There's no problem. They have a problem about the process of dying, the death process. They don't want to suffer. They don't want to be a burden. This is what elderly are telling you all the time, if you speak to them. Interesting, males prevent information to their farmers and females somewhat to mothers. I don't know why. There may be a difference between what the person declares and his actual truth. Yes, we cannot be sure. We know that people will tell you, answer in your questions according to what they think you want to hear, but this is still enough for us to understand. I mentioned in the beginning about this process of the ages of death. Well, about the age of 9 or 10, we start to realize that death is final, that if somebody dies, that's it. When their parents die tragically when they're 9 or 10, they are aware about this. It's very difficult for them. Adolescents, we're invulnerable, immortal. We can do what we want. Young adults they run, they do what they want. They jump off buildings, whatever. When they get into adulthood and they start becoming parents, suddenly things change and they become a bit more anxious because they don't want to leave their children behind or their wife or their spouse behind. And middle age is where the highest death anxiety. They're seeing the death of their friends, they're seeing the death of their parents, their siblings, they haven't done enough, they want to carry on. And when you get to old age, lowest anxiety. They're the ones who are facing death. They're the ones who are aware that this is the end of their life. And they're seeing death amongst their spouses and their peers. But they're less anxious about it. They're more anxious about being left alone. If they are married, suddenly they are alone in a house. You can't expect your children to come and live with you when their father dies. And so they become very anxious. That's when they become anxious about what's going to happen to me, not because they're going to die. They're quite happy to accept the process of death, but not the dying process. Death acceptance. It could be neutral, neither fearing or welcoming the event, but accepting of an inevitable of the death. It's going to occur. We're going to have it. Approach based on life after death, possibly, and escape, a welcome alternative to a life that is full of misery, particularly when people are suffering from depression. So, we are born with an innate need for meaning, but it may lie dormant because of our preoccupation with the daily business of living. But as we get older, death and suffering awaken in us an urgent need to suffer for meaning and purpose for life and death. So as we get to the age of middle age, that's when diseases are starting to come. When do we start seeing hypertension, Not often at the age of 20 or 30. It's usually 40, 50. That's when it's happening. When are we seeing heart attacks? Not at the age of myocardial infarctions, not at the age of so much at 20, 30. We're seeing it at 50, 60. So you're suddenly becoming aware of what's happening around you and what's going on. And this is what brings you into understanding. Your friends may be starting to have cancer, and that's what's putting you into tension and dealing with it. We can discover and create meaning in every situation in the face of death. For those of you who have never read the book by Viktor Frankl, The Meaning of Life, or I'm trying to remember it in English, but it's an exceptional book. He was in a concentration camp and managed to survive. Then he went to Canada, became a psychiatrist, and he said he became on the concept of how to find meaning of life, even in the lowest position that you possibly can, when you're seeing death in front of you. How can you find meaning? And that's what we've got to try and help our patients and in the elderly to understand, to try and find meaning even in times of dying. To solve the Shinto Buddhist way, to solve the problem of death, one must first solve the problem of living life. Again, we must live our life to the maximum we can. If one is able to do that, then there's nothing to be feared by the experience of death, because the experience of death is a natural part of life, as Confucius said. I love this drawing of peanuts, where Charlie Brown comes to line and says, "It's a beautiful little tree, isn't it?" Yes, it is. It's a shame that we won't be around to see it when it's fully grown. And Linus says, "Why? Where are we going? How can you say something like that?" Maybe the anxiety of not being around. Coping with death anxiety, biological, through our grandchildren and our children. This is how it's going to continue. This is how we see ourselves. Religious and spiritual, believing in an afterlife may be helpful. Creative, living through one's accomplishments. What have I succeeded in doing throughout my life? Have I done what I should have? Should I be happy with what I have succeeded? And then you will feel a sort of inner calmness. Interestingly, BBC reported that more people than ever are asking to be buried or cremated with their mobile phones when they die. And we know this. Look on the streets as people are walking. They don't walk and talk. They walk with holding a phone in the ear. You see the people all the time like this, walking the dogs, walking with children, all the time with a cell phone in their ear. And so obviously this has become their most important piece of connection to the world. So in summary, it takes time and experience to be comfortable dealing with death and dying, the dying process. We must learn how to deal with it. We must learn how to speak with it. We must learn to speak with our elderly, and more important, with the people who are helping them, the caregivers. The more involved you are in the process, the easier it becomes. And finally, you become a humanist, a friend, a comforter, what one should do for the elderly. We should do advanced care planning, the process of discussion between an individual and another, and this may or may not also include family or friends. You may be there for the advanced care planning. This is your right to speak with your patients and to ask them what they feel. The most difficult problem, and this is a last statement, is that death anxiety actually exists. Excuse me. Death anxiety actually exists more with the family members and staff. They are the ones who are having problems in terms of dealing with death, not the elderly. And I often ask people my philosophical question: am I die to live, or I live to die? What do I mean by this? If I say I die to live, it means I'm doing everything in my power to continue living. And if I say I live to die, it means that I'm going to live my life until I die. I want to live to die. I want to live and then I will die because I want to enjoy my life. And just to give you a view, that Haifa has a very nice port in the Baha'i Gardens. And thank you for your attention. If there are any questions, I'm welcome and open for questions.